Welcome, as ever, to History Matters, and so does coffee, and it's really coffee. It's not green juice, and I'm very excited about that simple fact. This is the 183rd episode, which I have remembered for 2 minutes, which I'm very proud of myself for. But that's amazing. You can that could be a bingo card thing. It's like Joanne marveling at the number of episodes.
Or just the number.
At any rate, today we're going to be talking about corruption. And when I tweeted, tooted, skeeted, fill in the weird verb, the announcement of what the topic is going to be today, I did it in all capital letters because you kind of have to write the word corruption in all capital letters. That's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into why I'm talking about it and what I'm going to suggest about it, I'm going to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted to be with all of you today, as always. Joanne is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then while she's doing that, you can continue to chat away. But if you have a question about today's topic, please put that down below in the Q&A. I'll be back in about 30 minutes to check out your questions.
Excellent. And I will add, as ever, if you are here for the first time, or one of the first times, please let us know, and the wonderful, amazing 183 episode strong History Matters community will welcome you, because it's a community at this point, and you will just be welcomed right into the middle of the community. Okay, so corruption. This is probably, I see, I'm not supposed to be looking at what's coming up in front of me, but I see someone named Pam said first timers. So Pam, thank you for coming. I have to stop myself from reading this because I always want to engage with you guys. The topic of corruption in some ways might seem to be obvious. It's been in the news in any number of different ways. And I actually, what sparked my interest today is Senator Bob Menendez. I'm not going to talk in great detail about him. It's something that he said about defending himself and something that Hamilton said, believe it or not, that's somewhat similar. That's what I want to talk about today. But if one were prone to talk a little bit more broadly about corruption, you could talk about the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who was acquitted of corruption charges just, a week ago, perhaps. Talk about Clarence Thomas in ever so many ways, if we chose to. It's been certainly in the news a lot, although people haven't always necessarily been using the word corruption. Many of them have. It's always a word, a concept, a factor that haunts politics. And as I suggested when I went out on social media, it certainly, first of all, the United States didn't invent it, but we're really good at it. And other nations are too. But certainly, if you're just looking at American history, the question of corruption, the fear, the haunt of corruption goes all the way back. Hamilton ended up sort of being a central figure in charges of corruption and in, according to Thomas Jefferson, talking about corruption. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Just let me start for a moment with Senator Bob Menendez. So according to the indictment from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, he and his wife received hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes from 3 New Jersey businessmen. The Hamilton line just went through my head, and I'm not going to say it. Someone out there will say it and put it in chat. About everything being legal in New Jersey. I just can't stop myself. At any rate, received hundreds and thousands of dollars in bribes from 3 New Jersey businessmen in the form of gold bars, cash, a luxury vehicle, and a number of other things. And in exchange, Menendez supposedly used the power of his position to benefit not just those businessmen, but also the government of Egypt, which is, I gather, where those 3 businessmen were from. Okay, so that's the charge, the corruption charge. What's interesting is that in an article I read this morning, and I have it, here it is. It's in today's New York Times. The person who wrote it is the reporter, or actually, I don't even know if it's an opinion piece or a reported piece. I think it's a reported piece. Benjamin Weiser, W-E-I-S-E-R. Menendez, according to Weiser in this article, began to defend himself by saying that prosecutors in this case were misrepresenting, quote, the normal work of congressional office. Now, off the top of one's head, one might think getting good deals for Egypt through businessmen, and this doesn't sound like normal work, the normal work of congressional office. However, as this article points out, the Supreme Court, and this is what set me off on this topic, the Supreme Court, according to the article, keeps narrowing what counts as corruption. And I read that and I thought, really? How does that work? How are they narrowing what counts as corruption? But then when you read a little further in the article, you realize what the article says is that the Supreme Court keeps restraining what the government can do regarding charges of corruption. That's the flip side, right? That's the Supreme Court saying, okay, corruption, whatever, but there should be a limit to what the government can call corruption. I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but that's not quite the same thing. Oh, there we go. Someone I see saying Weiser is a New York Times reporter. That's what I thought. But then as I was about to say it, I realized I wasn't 100% sure. At any rate, on the one hand, you can say the Supreme Court is narrowing what counts as corruption. On the other hand, you can say the Supreme Court is narrowing what the government can charge as being corruption. They're not exactly the same thing. And the fact that Menendez essentially said, you know, this is just the normal give and take of politics. They're misrepresenting, you know, setting up meetings with people, connecting people together. I don't know how gold bars fit in the normal routine business of politics, and I'm not going to ask. But at any rate, that question, that there's not a very necessarily bright, clean line separating what politicians do as politicians and what politicians shouldn't do as politicians, is a really interesting thought. So in a sense, that's part of what I wanted to address this morning. And as I hinted at the outset, what came to mind, not surprisingly at all, given that it's me, and also if you're thinking about the founding period, was Alexander Hamilton. Now, he's the money guy, right? When the government starts, he's the guy associated with money. So in and of itself, that's going to make him be prone to being charged with corruption. He's dealing with finance and the nation's money, and wealthy Americans of various sorts are kind of swirling around him, always looking for clues or hints about what the government's going to do so that they can invest whatever it is they want to invest. And I know I've come across over the years a handful of people who are like, I couldn't read his face, like he wasn't leaking any information, but he was certainly at the center of a group of people who really wanted to be insider trading in essence, and were looking for guidance from Hamilton. Now, Hamilton in turn wanted wealthy people to invest in the new government, right? And we've certainly talked about him enough before for you folks to know that he was always worried about this new government not being strong enough at the center, needing to be bolstered, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the ways in which he saw the government might be bolstered would be if wealthy and high-ranking people in America supported the government. So if he could find ways for them to invest in the government, and the Bank of the United States is part of this general idea, that would be good, because powerful, wealthy people would be investing personally and psychologically and politically in the government, and that would help the government. Now, of course, that can look shady, and there are shady aspects of it. So if you want to accuse Hamilton of favoring the wealthy and powerful, yes, he did. He saw himself as being practical. And this gets to a really interesting Hamilton story. And I have to tell you this morning. So I know the story. I went looking because I could remember parts of the quote. It's a Jefferson quote about Hamilton. And I remember that the word impracticable was in it, very 18th century way of looking at things. and the word corruption. So I'm kind of tap dancing my way around the quote. So I Google what I know of the quote, and something comes up. And I'm like, oh, excellent, there's the quote. And I swear this happened. I'm reading, and I'm like, yeah, it's the quote. Hey, that sounds like something I would say about that quote. Hey, it's work. And then I look, I wrote it. it's something I wrote for Mount Vernon. And I was on the edge of getting all riled up. I was going to be like, someone plagiarized my phrasing. Like, no, it was me. So I'm interested in this, actually. Mount Vernon, I believe it's an article at Mount Vernon on Jefferson and Hamilton in the cabinet. This is there. But at any rate, the story that I was looking for is this. Jefferson, in his retirement, is organizing his papers. He wants to organize his papers from when he was in the cabinet, when he worked in the Washington administration, to organize them into what he feels is a true narrative of what happened, as opposed to those Federalists, telling stories that aren't necessarily true. And he writes a kind of introduction to it. And he muses about a variety of things, including Alexander Hamilton. And he says in that introduction, Hamilton was a man of acute understanding, and says actually he had undoubted integrity in public and private life. I'm not going to say anything about the Reynolds pamphlet, but that Hamilton was convinced that, quote, corruption was essential to the government of a nation. Okay, so what does that mean? What did Hamilton mean? Now, the fact of the matter here is, and I will say at the outset, Hamilton did believe that. So this isn't just Jefferson like, how can I get to Jefferson? Hamilton does indeed say that. We come here to the body of the story. Okay, so the story is that Jefferson and Hamilton and Vice President John Adams, and I believe Secretary of War Henry Knox, are having a dinner at Jefferson's home. And as they would have put it in the 18th century, when the cloth was removed, meaning dinner is over, and now they're segueing off into conversation, coffee, maybe dessert, the cloth is removed, and the conversation strays into the subject of the British Constitution, as a conversation would if you have those four men sitting around a table in 1791, is I believe when this happens. So this is all from Jefferson here. Jefferson says, he remembers Adams saying, quote, purge the British Constitution of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would be the most perfect constitution ever devised by the wit of man. So purge it of its corruption, give to its popular branch equality of representation, it would be the most perfect constitution ever devised by the wit of man. At this point, and I love this is Jefferson, at this point, Hamilton paused. If you read Jefferson writing things that Hamilton said, he always inserts a dramatic pause before Hamilton like spouts corruption or something seemingly evil. Apparently, according to Jefferson, Hamilton always pauses before saying problematic things. So, Mr. Jefferson, so apparently he does this here. Hamilton paused and then says, purge the British Constitution of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would become an impracticable government. As it stands at present, with all its supposed defects, it is the most perfect government which ever existed. Corruption is necessary, right? So Adams says, well, purge it of its corruption, and the British Constitution would be the most perfect government ever created. And Hamilton says, oh, no, we need the corruption. With the corruption, it's actually the most perfect government ever created. Jefferson concludes from this, Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but for a monarchy bottomed on corruption, right? That shows it right there. And at other points, he talks about Hamilton having, again, Jefferson's language, a squadron devoted to the nod of the Treasury. And he's able to move around what people are doing in Congress And Jefferson fears that those kinds of men with that kind of influence could form, quote, the most corrupt government on earth. Now, what in the world did Hamilton mean by saying corruption is necessary? Well, to Hamilton, corruption was the sort of, as he meant it here, the personal give and take behind the scenes, the ways in which friends do things for friends, things that we very well might call corruption. But to Hamilton, that was part of statecraft. Like anyone practical knows, according to Hamilton, you got to do this sort of stuff. You got to mingle and finagle and, you know, not to an extreme point, but you can't strip all of that sort of behavior away and expect government, any government, to work. Very Hamiltonian, very like, you know, this is what human nature is like. So you have to deal with human nature as it is. That's basically what he's saying. So he means what he says. He's not saying people in office should do whatever they want with as much power as they want to whatever end they want. But he is acknowledging that some of what happens behind the scenes, which one might justifiably call corruption, needs to happen for government to be practical. Now, it's interesting, when Jefferson first becomes Secretary of State, for a time at least, there are some foreign diplomats who are more interested in at least talking to Hamilton because they consider Hamilton a realistic politician who understands the old world way, this fact that a certain amount of corruption is necessary, and that Jefferson is not going to operate under those principles. So it's not even as though this is a highfalutin dinner conversation, right? This is something that people are aware of, we're thinking about, we're casting charges at Hamilton constantly. If you look in, I would say after 1792, it's kind of 1792 is roughly when the Hamilton versus Jefferson fight launches and Federalist versus Republican becomes really more powerful. If you look in, if you have handy access to a newspaper database and you look in newspapers, politically minded newspapers, the National Gazette after 1792, you will see all of these charges of Hamilton, Federalists, corruption, political pamphlets. That was the main thing again and again and again and again. Corruption, corruption, corruption. Now, you know, it's interesting when you look at the long haul of people, scholars who've studied Hamilton, a number of them are absolutely convinced that he must have been personally corrupt with government money. And for a time, and it's been so long since I've looked at it, I'm not going to remember. But for a time, people were like trying to figure out how he himself profited off of what he did. And interestingly, I don't think he did. Having looked at Hamilton's books in a variety of ways and what he makes and what he doesn't and the fees he collects and the fees he doesn't and the fact that he's always in debt, I don't think he was raking in bucks through corruption in the way that one might think a corrupt politician does today. He was assuming a certain amount of corruption would benefit the government as he thought it should be. So is he personally benefiting from it? I suppose you could say if government goes the way he wants it to be, then his power might be better than his, I mean, we could construct ways in which the corruption is serving him, but financially benefiting him is not one of the things that was happening as far as what appears to be happening. Another way, again, in which people at the time accuse him of corruption, and again, you decide whether it is or isn't. He said this was very, as he would have put it, practicable. Others said not fair. Madison didn't like this at all. Hamilton, so when it was clear the government was going to do something about its Revolutionary War debts, speculators bought up mass quantities of IOUs that essentially veterans and others who were owed money from the revolution and were still hanging on to these IOUs, speculators with a sense that something was going to happen, bought up at extremely low prices all of these IOUs. The people who had these IOUs, again, poor veterans, needed the money. They were willing to sell these things for very little money. And these speculators, these wealthy speculators were like, yeah, I know, it says an IOU for $5. I'll give you whatever, 10 cents on the dollar. I have no idea what the equation was for that. But at any rate, there's mass purchasing of these IOUs from these speculators. Hamilton says, well, you know what? Those IOUs are essentially a form of cash. We can't possibly trace how the IOUs went from like a soldier to another guy to a speculator to now they're all over the place. So why don't we use the IOUs as a form of money, as cash, so that they are what they're worth? Whatever they started out being is what they're going to be worth now. It's going to help us. We don't have that much cash circulating. It'll be good for the new nation, blah, blah, blah. What that in effect does, as I'm sure you've already arrived there, is benefit all these speculators who are like, essentially cheating all these people out of their money. That is indeed what that did. To Hamilton, this was practical because there was, number one, no way to follow the complicated trails of where these IOUs went and how they were divided and split up and bought and rebought and sold on the one hand. And on the other hand, using them as a kind of currency was really necessary and useful, right? So to Hamilton, he's like, well, this is good, it's practical. Madison just saw this as the most unfair thing, and a lot of other people did too. Like, what do you mean? You're essentially depriving, you're cheating poor veterans out of the money they deserve because you're crediting these purchases by these speculators. You're going to give them the money. So you can see how, according to the Hamiltonian definition of the term, if that's corruption, if speculators got a sense things were happening and bought these certificates up very cheap and then capitalized on that, is that corruption? Maybe. And if it is, then yeah, Hamilton was okay with it. And being, again, in a very Hamiltonian sort of way, declared it. Yeah, we need some corruption in government. That's just the way it is. Which gets us back to Menendez and where we started. So Menendez is partly saying, a lot of what I do, like meeting with businessmen, setting up deals, connecting people of influence, whatever, that's the normal business of what a politician, what a member of Congress does. So how can you declare these things in and of themselves as being corrupt? Now, I don't know the details of the indictment. And again, you'll read the Weiser article, and there are people quoted in the article who say that some people who have read through the indictment and seen the charges think that there's plenty there that will substantiate charges of corruption. Again, I don't know that for a fact. And that's, we will watch that unfold. But the interesting part of this, and the part that I really have highlighted and wanted to highlight today, is the fact that you think, or certainly one might think, corruption when you see it. The same thing as that people once said about pornography. What's pornography? Well, you know it when you see it. We know that that's a problem nowadays. You might say the same thing about corruption. Corruption. You know it when you see it. Well, it's complicated. And I'm not being Hamiltonian here and excusing a certain amount of corruption as being necessary. But what I am saying is it's not an absolutely clean, clear line between the business of politics and corruption. It's part of why we have ethics codes, right? And again, what should the Supreme Court have an ethics code? That might be nice. Ethics codes divide a line, right? Ethics codes are a line. And the ethics codes say, well, if you do this, sorry, dude, you cross the line. If you do this, we may not like it, but it's okay. There isn't a clean line. It's part of why we're constantly swirling amidst charges of corruption, trying to figure out if the charges are true. Ethics codes are handy in this way, and fighting an ethics code is an interesting strategy that needs to be thought about. But generally speaking, I suppose what I'm saying here in the midst of all of our current public discourse about corruption is to, generally speaking, I was about to say assume nothing, but we've seen a lot of stuff about Clarence Thomas, so I'm having a hard time uniformly applying that. But let me put it this way, in a general sense. If you had asked folks in the founding era what was a way to fight against corruption, they would have said, well, an alert and active press, number one, making things, if not transparent, opening things to the public is one way to fight corruption, because if people see it or are able to see it, at least some people might not be willing to commit that kind of an act. So public access, and alert press, codes of ethics, and again, more than anything else, and I say this probably every episode, an alert public, right? So now, and we have been and will continue to be swimming in discussion of, and I have not uttered the former president's word name at all in this conversation, but we are in a sea of charges of corruption. And there has been a lot of corruption. We're determining now how much of it we can prove in a way that's credible in a court of law. But we need to be aware of the fact that that line between normal, quote unquote, politics and corruption is a messy one. And what that means is we really do need to be alert, to consider the precise information that's being tossed at us by people who either really do or really don't want us to see something as being corrupt. Entirely possible that something that might seem as though it isn't corrupt really is when you get more information, or vice versa, that something that seems exceedingly corrupt isn't once you get more information. So on the one hand, I'm urging you to be alert to what's going on, to not tune out because the word corruption is going to be buzzing all over the place, but also as savvy, history-minded, history-informed people to consider the fact that you need to think carefully about what is or isn't corruption. You might see more than you expect, you might see less than you expect, but it's vitally important to see it when it's there. So the fact that it can sort of be masked or mask it itself as the normal business of politics, really important thing to consider. And I think, according to this article I read this morning, that might be a big part of what Menendez and his attorneys claim as this proceeds further. Okay, I'm 2 minutes over. Mug. It is indeed mug time. Let me close. I ran out of time, and I didn't have time to print my notes. So I was actually kind of reading them off the screen. Let me make it bigger so I can see everyone. Okay, so the mug, I think I've used it before, I think. But you'll see why it makes sense. First of all, obviously, Hamilton was the easy choice, right? When I was running around, I was like, okay, I talk a lot about Hamilton corruption. I have a lot of Hamilton mugs. This is probably a Hamilton case, but this is at least slightly better than just Hamilton. So first of all, one side of the mug says Hamilton, the exhibition. And for those who are new, Pam, I think was her name, who said she's new, every week for 183 weeks. I have, at the end of my comments, come forward with a mug that somehow relates to what I have been talking about. And I do not have 183 mugs, so definite repeats. So this one is Hamilton the Exhibition. It's the exhibition that was put up in Chicago that I worked on. I was the main historical consultant on it. It only existed for a short amount of time, so I suppose you could say this is a collector's item. But the reason I picked this mug is because of what it says on the back. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? We're talking about the stories that are being told, right? Who can see what you're doing? Who can not see what you're doing? And what aspects of what you're doing become public knowledge? So I think that actually, like, I am less embarrassed by pulling that forward than I have been with my past attempts to sort of slide mugs into a conversation. That is the theory behind that mug. Okay, good mug. I've been, I try so hard not to see on the bottom of the screen everybody talking, and I'm like, I can't look. That's a good comment. I can't look, but now I can look again. So, and it looks like people have had a lot to to say today. A lot to say. There's a lot to say. So, yep, okay.
There's a lot to say. We've been lamenting the end of local newspapers, part of the thread, pointing out examples of corruption. Mayor Barry from DC came up in that chat a couple times. But we do have questions we want to get to. So I'm going to hop in. Our good friend Lois McMillan, who teaches in Oregon, has a couple of questions. I'm going to start with this one. How does Jefferson's view of corruption and what is going on in France before and after the revolution? She's teaching that this week. She wanted to know if you could comment on that.
Oh, interesting. So in other words, how would Jefferson have processed whatever was going on in France? Well, certainly some, I mean, and I'll speak in a general sense, some of what Jefferson might have said would have been about monarchy and the tradition of monarchy and what monarchies are like and the corruption that monarchies breed. So some of what he might have been seeing would have been that. You know, in general, what he said about bloodshed in the streets and guillotines and all of that is, and some of you probably already thinking of the quote that has something to do with the fact that a little blood must be shed in the cause of liberty. Boy, that quote's been used by a lot of people in ways that he didn't intend it. But still, that idea that whatever was going on in France and was going on in excess in France was part of the spread of liberty that the United States had sparked, and it was going to spread around the globe. And France was proof that it was beginning to spread. And what was going on there was the messiness of the spread of liberty. That was a lot of his logic about, let us just call it the messiness of things that were going on in France, that you had to excuse it. He has a lot of extreme language about how much blood is required and if there's only an Adam and Eve left, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of extreme language because it touches right on the thing that most charges, or one of the things that most charges Jefferson, which is this idea that there's this spark of liberty that can spread and that the United States is what lit it and it's going to spread through the old world and it's going to change the world. So generally speaking, I think that's probably where he would have gone, like, yeah, what's happening there? Not ideal in many ways, but at the end, you know, they will have moved towards liberty and the world will be a better place. I think that's the channel he might have gone towards.
She has a follow-up question, and because she's a teacher, I'm putting her to the top of the queue. She says, did Hamilton, Jefferson, or Adams ever differentiate between corruption versus unethical?
Oh. Well, so corruption was very much the word and idea they would have used. You know, it's the word that's everywhere. It's the idea that's everywhere. In that sense, it's not taking a modern idea or concept and imposing it on the past. That they talked about corruption all the time. Unethical, you know, what would be an interesting thing to do, and one of you can do that even as we're sitting here. You could go to the Founders Online database and just search on ethical and unethical and see what comes up. That would be the first thing that I would do to see. I think you're going to see a lot more mentions of corruption than ethical or unethical, but I don't think that means they didn't talk about it. Ethical and unethical sort of touches more on ideas about honor than corruption does, right? Ethical and unethical has a morality component to it. So I don't know the answer to this question offhand, but it would be interesting to see if they're using those words in different ways, because ethical or unethical, if someone says you're corrupt, you're going to be angry and you're going to respond. If someone says you're unethical, they might be calling you a liar, and that's like dual worthy. So there's something there about how those words are used and how much they're used. I don't know about ethical. Corruption, you're going to see a lot. But that's a great idea. I see someone just said, great idea. I don't know if the great idea was because of what I just said, but it's a great way to use the Founders Online database, generally speaking, and I'm sure it would work. 2 results for unethical and Founders. Okay, see, there you go.
So fast.
Yes, I know. Is that you can use that database and have students search for, and you can use it any number of ways, right? You could use it as a way to teach students how people at the time talked about things or considered things, or the words they use being different. Or you can, you know, impose modern ideas and say, well, this is modern idea, something that they thought about. Anyway, you can use that database, the amazing database. Like that, you know, slowly has been coming together since I was in grad school. And I was the person who, so every semester, I take my undergrad seminar to the library and we get like an update at the library. They highlight databases that will be useful for research papers in this time period and anything new that the library has now that can help 18th century research. There's always something new. And I'm always in the back of the room behind my students going, oh my gosh. Yeah. So And the fact that you could get through as much material as you can get through and do searches, mind-boggling. In a million years, I couldn't have really imagined it as a grad student. Annie has just vanished. This is not good. And she's taken questions with her. Okay, well, while we're waiting, I would see here that Tim found 1,109 hits for the word corruption, as opposed to 2 for, was it unethical? Now, the problem here might be, as I was just hinting a moment ago, unethical or ethical might not be a word that they're using very much. It just hasn't come into vogue yet. So the next thing one might do in this exercise is go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up ethical and unethical and see when they came into use big time versus sort of being on the edge. And I don't know the answer to that question. So we might be seeing a time when there's another word being used instead of unethical, and that over time that becomes more common. I don't know the answer to that. I also don't know where Annie went, and I'm feeling very lonesome. I wonder if I can get to the questions. Where are the questions? I don't think I have. Oh, okay, wait. Okay, so I think I do have the questions. So we're waiting for Annie. So Gloria says, was not Hamilton honest while he... Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand Gloria's question. Was he honest? So what it says is, was not Hamilton honest while does it and is duplicitous about it? And I do not fully understand, Gloria. If you can better explain your question, I will go with it. Okay, George says, well, how about women in corruption? That's a really, really interesting question. Okay, this is not going to surprise you at all. Annie's back. Took me a while. Like, I think I found questions. Anyway, I just took George's question about what about women in corruption. What's interesting is that, and well, once again, this is Jefferson. Men, certainly in the 18th century, when for the most part, men thought women should have nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with public life. Many men thought that women were able to be, and often could be, and would be profoundly corrupt. He's talking elite women, because they could finagle between the lines. They were not as, because they weren't absolutely in public life, they could sort of maneuver ways and places in private life and have influence and make things happen in a way that men couldn't, because women were sort of non-seen, sort of not there. And he says this at one point, I'm trying to remember where. It might be in a letter to the wealthy family from Philadelphia, whose name I have forgotten. It'll come back. But at any rate, he certainly thought that, and he's not the only one that thought that, you know, women could be very corrupt, precisely because men put them in a position where they weren't fully present. And so they could do all sorts of things and not get noticed for it. You know, it's like, I remember seeing a letter in which someone during Washington's first term comes up with the idea that it would be great if you could use, it's really ridiculous, use Martha Washington as a spy, because no one would ever suspect she was listening to what people were saying. So you could just plant her at various events and have her just sit there, and she could hear everything and could tell us everything. No, Martha Washington had absolutely no interest in doing this and really did not enjoy being First Lady. And so generally speaking, this was not going to work. But the fact that some men thought that, you know, plant a woman there, she can do all kinds of stuff and people won't notice it because she's a woman, that's the sort of weird conglomeration of things that surrounded women in corruption in this time period.
Now I'm thinking about a Martha Washington action figure, like a secret spy.
I'm trying to remember. Okay, I'm going to show this out there. So there's a really wealthy Philadelphia family, and there's a book about the man, I think, called the Golden something. I want to say that their name begins with B, and that's where I've gotten so far. But somebody, one of our wonderfully informed people here. I'm going to close questions and answers now since Annie is back. Might be able to find it. Oh, Tim came up with this Al Jazeera piece, Corruption is as American as Apple Pie. I actually had that open this morning. And it's an opinion piece, and it got so opinionated that I thought, well, I'm interested in this, but I would rather not quote from an op-ed, but rather quote from something that appears to be a reported piece of journalism. God, what is the name of these people? And that's right. George points to Abigail Adams and land deals. Indeed.
All right, so I lost my questions when we had a little power failure here at the museum, no. but I can see new ones. So if somebody had one that didn't get answered, if you put it back in the Q&A, I'll pick it up. But Miriam added one after I logged back in, so we'll let Miriam's question hop in here while the others add theirs back again. She wanted to know where the line is between informed, long-time knowledge bordering on inside information and corruption, if that's even possible. So, you know, insider information versus corruption.
Oh, is there a difference between the two? I think that falls into the, well, on the one hand, I would say insider information used for your personal benefit is bad. you go to jail. It's illegal. Is there the ability in some way for some form of that to not be formally, exactly, Carolee says Martha Stewart. Are there ways in which something like that might not be illegal or corrupt? I don't know that. Offhand, if you have insider access and you use that to benefit yourself in some way, sell stock, buy stock, whatever it is that people are doing, yeah, that's the sort of thing that should not be happening, and particularly when it involves government figures. I actually did, and I didn't quote them. Let me open it here. I actually did, as I always do, look up definitions of things. And I looked up the word corruption just to see, generally speaking, how people defined it, kind of thinking along these lines. And there are a number of different definitions, but generally speaking, dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery, was one common definition. Another was the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which gets us beyond people with political power, but either way, those are both definitions that can be very, very broad, and that takes us to the end of my comments this morning, which is let's think about what we're seeing and what it means, not in the sense that, you know, well, some things, let's dismiss some corruption if we're not absolutely sure, but really more to be alert and aware of what we're seeing more than anything else. If that means we see even more corruption, so be it.
Yeah.
I also want to say, when you vanished, Annie, there was a Gloria, I know you did. I was like, I'm all by myself. There was a Gloria question that I wasn't quite sure what she meant. And then she came back and said, I'm going to go back here. I had to do, I think, with Jefferson.
She put it back in.
Jefferson was corrupt, while saying that Hamilton was, but Jefferson, yeah, no, well, Jefferson, as a matter of fact, if you find that Mount Vernon piece that I got angry at this morning because someone copied me, and I wrote it, you'll see the next paragraph after what I just described talks about a Jeffersonian equivalent, which is him having these dinner parties and planting different people at the dinner parties and steering the conversation in certain directions and then tracking how people vote. And he says, you know, I never influence legislators. Oh, no, not me. Well, in his own way, he does. Is that corruption? We could debate that, but certainly, Hamilton is talking about corruption in a very old world kind of a way, a very traditional kind of a way. And how Jefferson defines it and how that is similar or different to how Hamilton sees it is actually a really interesting question.
Yeah. Okay, Debbie has a couple of questions, at least in the new version of the Q&A. One of them is, many political scientists believe cities, for example, operated more efficiently and effectively in the era of Tammany Hall style corruption. Is this an illustration of Hamilton's opinion?
Oh, well, so Tammany Hall, the famous sort of political machine-ish thing in New York, cronyism at its best, kind of like a political club, political in all capital letters and having all kinds of influence. I guess the difference there would be that Tammany Hall wasn't formally part of government. So Hamilton is talking about how there are some aspects of politics that need to be present, and they might look shady, but they have to be there or else impracticable. It will be impracticable as a government. Tammany Hall, he might have issues with, not simply because he would say, oh, it's people outside the government having influence. He was not really fond of, to be diplomatic about it, organizations that formed themselves outside of government and then tried to have power, right? So he was like not thrilled with Democratic Republican societies. He generally speaking, and he wasn't even thrilled with banks that erupted and didn't seem to be run orderly banks that were part of the system. He didn't like organizations that had power or were claiming power or exercising power outside of government circles, because he wanted the government to be the main source of power. So he might have been suspect of Tammany Hall, particularly because after a while, it would not have been something that sided with Federalists. That said, he's someone who in like 1802, I think, is trying to figure out a way to convert the Society of the Cincinnati into being something that will help the Federalists. So as much as he might have said, I don't like Tammany Hall, he's also thinking, this be handy. So even with an individual, you can't, there's not, certainly with Hamilton, there aren't clean lines. He would say, well, but I'm serving the general good, right? And the nation's going to fall apart if we don't do this thing. And what he says in the election of 1800, right? Like, we have to break the law. We have to do things we might not do under other circumstances because of the dire crisis that we're in. That's a dangerous kind of thin ice to be walking out on, but it does touch on everything that we're talking about here, about corruption and something that's ethical or unethical.
All right. Our good friend Sydney, our favorite student who joins us. Sydney asks, is corruption something we can prevent, or is it just unavoidable?
Well, can we absolutely prevent corruption? No. Can we have codes and laws that define what it is and make it easier to pinpoint and harder to get away with? Yes. I guess I'm sounding Hamiltonian. I don't think you can eliminate, and I'm not going to say as Hamilton did, the corruption's the good part. I will say that we're not going to eliminate, I mean, in all of human existence, unfortunately, I hate to say this to Sydney, our student, I want to be,
I know, we're crushing her little spirit.
I don't think you can eliminate corruption, but I do think being aware of it, finding ways to cast a light on it, highlighting it, pinpointing it, drawing lines of what's allowable and what isn't allowable, those things are really, really important for the precise reason that you can't eliminate it, right? I mean, Madison, right? If all men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. No one ever assumes that humankind could be above and beyond corruption. The question is, how do you define it? How do you, or do you enforce it? What do you do about it? Do you hold people, coming back to this other word I like, above and beyond contingency, do you hold people accountable? Is there going to be accountability for proven, obvious corruption? That gets us back to democracy, because if people with power can do corrupt things and are not held accountable for it in any way, that's going to erode democracy on so many levels. Confidence in government, the fact that people in power are accountable to us for how they use it. There are any number of ways in which accountability ties in with this problem of corruption and the survival of democracy as well.
I hope we didn't crush your spirit, Sydney.
I know, Sydney, I'm so sorry.
She's so optimistic.
Practicable is such a good word. Oh, I wanted to say one thing only because I've seen it now come up in the chat again and again and again. Aaron Burr. People keep saying, is he corrupt? Is he corrupt? Is he corrupt? Hamilton would say yes. Surprise! No, he
spoiler.
I know. He, he thought that Burr was absolutely opportunistic, did whatever it took at any moment to get what he wanted at any moment, didn't have like one sort of political guiding star, like one political principle that guided him. He was just sort of doing things in the spur of the moment as he saw fit. And Hamilton, an ambitious guy who would have loved to do things in the spur of the moment as he saw fit, but held himself back, horrified him because he totally understood the impulse on Burr's part. So, there's in the Hamilton documentary from a while back, I talk about this, about how people said during the election of 1800, like, Burr is such a handy guy. He's not tied down by any pesky principles. He just like does what helps in the moment. Hamilton is like, not tied down by pesky principles. Are you nuts? So, Hamilton thought that Burr was corrupt. Burr, was he opportunistic? Yes. Was he out and out corrupt? Not in the way that Hamilton assumed. I do think that Burr gets a bit of a bum rap. He's kind of become the villain in our history books. That said, I do think he enjoyed being engaged in shady dealings. He liked being mysterious. There's a reason why he didn't write things down, right? Written things last. Don't put them in writing. So he's an interesting character. There's an essay. There's an essay that one of my students could write, now that I'm thinking about it, who wants to write about Aaron Burr. I might have just gotten a paper topic for one of my undergrads. Was Burr corrupt? How do we define corruption, and was he corrupt? He gets, accused of treason. One could talk about that. At any rate, it's a really good question. Was he corrupt by the terms of his time? Or would he be considered, I guess by the terms of our time, would he be considered corrupt? Probably not, because what are we calling corrupt these days? But at any rate, how could I not mention Aaron Burr in the course of this conversation? So.
All right. Sydney had a follow-up question. She wanted to know why some people seem to be corrupt and get it swept under the rug, and others are absolutely devastated by the corruption coming to light. Like, how do some people get away with it, I think is what she's asking.
How do some people just keep cruising on? Well, I think in part, so it has to do with two things. Well, more than two things, but two of the things it has to do with. Number one, how is the person being accused of something going to respond? And if you have a rock hard shield and you can really just keep storming ahead, like, nope, I'm doing what I'm doing and it's what I did. And, whatever, you go do what you do and say what you say. I'm going to, basically, if you cannot respond in some way so that you're denying the charge by just not even accepting it. I suppose that's one way. I mean, another way people get away with it is that it becomes a news story for one day, or it gets explained away or dismissed away, or mired in political talk, and then it becomes less real because it becomes seemingly more partisan. What it brings to mind for me, which isn't the same thing, but kind of is, many, many, many years ago, there was a historian, it won't surprise you to say, an older male historian, and I think I was still a grad student. Who was really did not like my work and thus did not like me. And at a conference, I was on the panel, and this particular historian stood up and really just attacked my work. And I was sitting, facing the audience, and he was just going after my work in a really, in my mind, unprofessional way. And what I remember is, and I could see people in the audience were like, that's happened to me more than once, I'll say. But at any rate, I just sat up there and I played it up. I was like, I just had a hammy response, sir, whatever. And then afterwards, he came up to me and he said something like, boy, I got you there. And I said, did you? Because I don't think not. And that reminds me of what you've just asked, the question you've just asked, right? I refused to allow him in. Like, whatever you said, dude, in this case, I hadn't done anything wrong. Might be really complicated if I had, but still, I just refused. I was just like, yeah, no, actually, I'm not embarrassed by what you said. I don't like what you said. It's actually, I don't consider it right. And you're kind of a jerk. So how do people get away with it? I think sometimes just the chutzpah, which is not good necessarily, but sometimes you finesse a situation in ways that aren't necessarily good. And since it's public opinion ultimately that matters in a democratic mode of politics, that can have a lot of influence. We are right at 11 o'clock.
We are. There are some more questions. It's up to you if you want to try and squeeze any more in.
We could try another. How many more are there?
There's 3 left.
Okay, let's try and see what happens.
All right, Kathleen V, she didn't get one in today. Hers says, what was the public perception of corruption during the founders' time versus today? Do you think we have less standards today? Ooh, that's sad.
I know. We have, well, I guess I'll put it this way. We definitely have different standards. Do we have fewer standards? I guess I'm not gonna buy into a sort of the good old days when everyone was honest and good, and it's all been downhill since. In a way, really, there weren't good old days in the way that we want there to be good old days. And whatever we try and create that good old time, the founders, they were better than us. Well, they thought about posterity in ways that many people nowadays in politics don't. They thought about their honor a lot, but not because they were amazingly honorable, but because they were worried about being accused of being dishonorable, but still that was an issue. They talked a lot about corruption because history showed that corruption was something that could bring down governments, and that republics were particularly vulnerable and fragile. They were well-versed. They were better versed in history on an elite level. Elite political figures in that time knew history better than the people do who govern us now. But I guess I wouldn't sign on and say that somehow they were better than us and we have sunk down over time. There are a lot of books. We just read one for my undergrad seminar, and floating throughout it, I can think of a handful of books written about this time period, the founding, and floating within them somewhere is, those were before the present days, like that was a different time. And part of me always kind of is totally uncomfortable with that. It's like, well, no, like the founding isn't a magical golden age. And if you said it was to some of the most practical, reality-minded, John Adams would never take that. John Adams was, and said again and again and again, and I think I've said at some point in some of the many past episodes we have here, how Adams in his old age just wrote again and again and again and again to people, asking him, like, tell us about the founding. And he would say, we didn't know what we were doing, and we weren't particularly better than you in any way, and we made mistakes, and there were all kinds of people who didn't want to do any of the things that you think are wonderful, didn't want to sign the Declaration of Independence and any number of things. So anyway, that's my drawn out answer. Even though we've gone over time, I got a little carried away, so my apologies.
Okay. Do you want to say the after party?
Maybe let's go to the after party.
Okay.
Because I know some people are going to have to lead. Carly, I think practicable and practical. The 18th century has a way of adding syllables. They do. Some words just add in syllables. Okay. So, actually, so I will mention that I am going to be doing an Inside the Vault Gilder Lehrman event this coming Thursday. I want to say it's like at 6 o'clock at night. I'm not absolutely sure. On the Reynolds pamphlet. So you should totally come. But right now it's time for the after party. What that means for those who are new is that we will no longer be recording, so that we can be even freer and easier in our discussion and talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. I want, as ever, to thank everyone who came here for today's episode, for coming 183 times. Maybe not everyone came 183 times, but generally speaking, the idea is there. It really matters. It matters a lot. It even just in getting us to think about these topics. Let's have a conversation about corruption and what it is and why we should think about it. There aren't that many places in your life where you get to have a moment to consider things like that, right? And those are the sorts of conversations that have to be happening in a lot of places, high and low, east, west, north, south, for democracy to function really well. So thank you for being here yet again and engaging in the conversation of democracy. I hope everyone does have a wonderful, wonderful week. I want to thank Annie and John as ever for being here and making this possible and doing different wonderful things that you do that make this not only possible, but a good thing. It could not exist in ever so many ways without you. And I so appreciate you guys on a personal note. Just thank you guys for being here every week with me. Okay, so I lost track even of the conversation. I'm like always trying to, I'm not good at like multitasking. Oh, and one last thing before we poof. I just want to thank everybody for checking in on Newbie, because when people like love this little green bird, it just warms my heart. It's like, oh, people care about the little bird. Mona, she might have left already, but thank you so much for coming. I hope you will come back. And okay, let us segue to the after party.